Nobles. I'm director of the honors program. And I'm always very pleased to see all sorts of people, students, faculty, staff, people from the larger Atlanta community come together for events like this. So thank you very much for coming. A few other thank yous, if I may. Certainly events like this don't just happen. And this one wouldn't have happened without the energy and the organizational skills and frankly the sheer force of will of my colleagues in the honors program office. Two of them are remarkably skilled student assistants, Katie Geddes, who couldn't be here tonight, but Mike Jasper, who is back on the video device. Also another thank you in absentia to our remarkably skilled and soon to be remarkably successful graduate student, Victor Lesneski, who is up now interviewing at MIT, where I think he will finally wind up. Our academic advisor and keeper of all things undergraduate, Nicole Leonard. And perhaps above all, our associate director of the honors program, Monica Hall. Has been for the past 6 years the real driving force behind this lecture, who's organized and done everything that needs doing and organizing. So I think without her, this event would not take place, or certainly wouldn't take place with the kind of quality that it does. So if you'll join me, please, in just another manual expression of appreciation for these people.
Thank you.
And having thanked everyone, let me also invite everyone to silence or perhaps better turn off your electronic devices. We'll try to go text and Twitter free for an hour. It might be a revelation. Well, I usually begin this event with a few good words about the man for whom this lectureship was named, the late Les Karlovitz. A man who, like me, will be very happy to see tonight's turnout, to see everybody here. When I first came to Georgia Tech, Les Karlovitz was the Dean of the College of Sciences and Liberal Studies, which is our old version of the Arts and Sciences College. And Les Karlovitz was a dean with very good ideas. And one of his ideas is that it's good for people to come hear a good talk about something connected to science. A talk that speaks not specifically to scientists alone, but to all of us, people like me, people who need to hear what I call accessible science. And that's why I think Les Karlovitz would be especially happy to see all of you here tonight. Les died in 1990, but it's very fitting that this lectureship bear his name. And tonight, I'd like to say a special word about another dean, my friend Paul Houston, who is the current dean of the College of Sciences, and who is, I'm very sad to say, stepping down as dean at the end of this year. I'm sad because Paul is, as Les Karlovitz was, a dean with ideas and with good ideas, but also with a very good sense of decency and generosity. A man I much admire for sustaining, even embracing, this institutional friendship between the honors program and the College of Sciences, and a man I much admire for, if I may use this too often cheapened and trivialized term, leadership. Paul Houston is the sort of dean, the sort of leader who served this university well, and I will miss him as dean. He is simply a good guy. And now I'll ask you to join me in a moment of appreciation for Paul Houston as he comes to the podium.
Thanks all of you very much. It's been a pleasure to be dean of the College of Sciences for now almost 6 years, and I've enjoyed it. But one of the pieces I enjoy most is planning and attending the Karlovitz lecture. So today we are honored to have Dr. Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist and a research professor in the Department of Anthropology at Rutgers University, as our Karlovitz speaker. Dr. Fisher got her bachelor's degree in 1968 at NYU, and her double major actually in anthropology and psychology. Psychology, as you may not know, is a department in the College of Sciences at Georgia Tech, and perhaps rightly so. In 1975, we got our PhD at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and there are a long list of topics that PhD covers. Physical anthropology, human evolution, biology, human sexual behavior, reproductive strategies. So I think you can already see as a PhD student that Dr. Fisher was well along the way to the topics that she's become known for. She's written 5 books on the evolution and future of human sexuality, monogamy, adultery, divorce, gender differences in the brain, the chemistry of romantic love, and most recently, human personality types, and why we fall in love with one person rather than another. Fisher maintains that humans have evolved 3 core brain systems for mating and reproduction. And they are, briefly, lust, romance, and attachment. Please welcome Helen Fisher to present the 2012-2013 Carl Dix Lecture on Lust, Romance, and Attachment, the Drive to Love and Who We Choose.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that you're here. I and my colleagues, Lucy Brown, Art Aaron, and Bianca Acevedo, have now put over 100 people into a brain scanner who were madly in love. The first 17 were people who were happily in love. The second 15 were people who had just been rejected in love. And the third group were people who were in their 50s and 60s, all married an average of 21 years, all maintained that they were still madly in love with their partners. We weren't sure whether we believed them. We put them in the machine, and I'll tell you what happened there. Then in the year 2005, I had written my fourth book, and Match.com, the internet dating site, came to me, called me a couple days before Christmas, and asked me to come in and meet with them a couple days after Christmas. I come from New York. Nothing happens at Christmas in New York, but they wanted to meet with me, so I went in, and 11 people filed in. I couldn't figure out who they were. It ended up being the CEO on down. And we had a day meeting, and in the middle of the morning they asked me, why do you fall in love with one person rather than another? And at the time I said, I don't know. Nobody knows. And they asked me if I would start a new dating site with them, which I did. It's called chemistry.com, and I created a questionnaire that's now been taken by 13 million people in 40 countries. And so I've been studying not only the brain circuitry of how you feel when you love, but what it is that drives you naturally to one person rather than another. So that's the story of the evening. In the jungles of Guatemala, there stands a temple. It's built by the grandest Sun King of the grandest city-state Tikal, of the grandest New World empire, the Mayan. His name was Casaconchalo. He stood over 6 feet tall. He lived into his 80s, and he's buried beneath this monument in or around 720 AD. And Mayan inscriptions proclaim that he was deeply in love with his wife. She died young, so he built a temple for her facing his. And every spring and autumn, exactly at the equinox, the sun rises behind his temple and perfectly bathes her temple with his shadow. And as the sun sets behind her temple, it perfectly bathes his temple with her shadow. Today, almost 1,300 years later, these two lovers still touch from the grave. Around the world, people love. They sing for love. They dance for love. They compose poems and stories and ballets and operas and movies and plays about love. They retell myths and legends about love. They have love charms, love potions, and love magic. They pine for love. They live for love. They kill for love. And they die for love. It's one of the most powerful brain systems that's ever evolved in a human animal. It's now quite clear that it's been found in every single place in the world where anthropologists have looked. They have found romantic love. There are no exceptions. It's actually more than 200 societies now where anthropologists have looked. I did my own study of it among Americans in general, circuitry for that intense feeling of romantic love. And matter of fact, I seem to be a one in America who not only knows that men are just as romantic as women, but I would maintain that they're even more romantic. There's a great deal of data to support that. We can talk about it at a different time. Anyway, there's no gender difference. Who you choose to love, how you express your love is going to vary from one person and probably from one gender to the next. But the actual feeling of romantic love is like the fear system in the brain. And in fact, it can be felt at any age. I was giving a speech in New York to mothers. It was a luncheon speech, and it was to mothers. And in the middle of it, I stopped and I said, does anybody have a child who's in love? And one woman said, yes, she did. And she said there's a particular, she had a little boy, and she said, every time a particular little girl comes over for a play date, all he does is sit next to her and just and stroke her hair. And then when she leaves, she's depressed for about an hour and a half. So I said to her, I said, well, how old is your son? And she said, he's 2.5. So we're not talking about the sex system. We're talking about the brain circuitry for attraction to a certain individual. There's nice data out of London now, done by a guy called Bartelzecchi and his group, who've shown that heterosexuals and homosexuals show exactly the same brain circuitry for romantic love. Once again, we're not studying who you fall in love with, we're studying how you feel when you love. And gays are just like straights. So I came to believe that this was a human universal, and perhaps if I looked in the brain, I could begin to understand it. I think it's one of 3 basic brain systems that evolved from mating and reproduction. Sex drive, craving for sexual gratification, linked with the testosterone system in both men and women. W.H. Auden called it an intolerable neural itch, and indeed that's what happens. The second brain system, and it's linked not only with testosterone, but it can have no object. You can feel the sex drive when you're driving home in your car, when you read a book or see a movie. It's not necessarily focused on, you can feel it for a lot of different people at the same time also. Romantic love is the second brain system. Passionate love, obsessive love, being in love, infatuation, whatever you want to call it. It's focused on one human being. And in fact, George Bernard Shaw once, he said, love consists of overestimating the differences between one woman and another. And indeed, that's pretty much what we do. I'm going to maintain this link with the dopamine and norepinephrine system at low levels of the serotonin system. And attachment is the third brain system. Other scientists have linked this with different neurochemicals, oxytocin and vasopressin. I think that these 3 brain systems evolved to do different things. I think the sex drive evolved to get you out there looking for a whole range of partners. Yeah, sex with a lot of different people. I think romantic love evolved to enable you to focus your mating energy on just one at a time. And I think that the third brain system of attachment evolved to enable you to tolerate this human being and just long enough to raise a child together as a team. We have all kinds of connections with each other. You know, when you fall madly in love with somebody, suddenly they become extremely sexually attractive to you. You know, 2 weeks ago it was just a nice guy in the gym, or somebody in class, or somebody you're working with. All of a sudden, everything about him is sexually attractive. The way she flips her hair, the way he gets on the bike, everything becomes sexually attractive. And it's probably because as you're driving up dopamine with that intense romantic love, there's a positive correlation with the testosterone system, so it's going to trigger the sex drive. And of course, that's the whole point of romantic love, to focus on somebody and start the mating process. But can the reverse be true? Can you sort of have casual sex with somebody and then fall in love with them? Well, most Americans have had sex with somebody and not fallen in love with them. But in fact, it can happen. And the reason it can happen is because as you have sex with somebody, you are driving up the dopamine system. And that can push you over the threshold into falling in love with them. You can also begin to feel deep attachment to them because with orgasm there's a real flood of oxytocin and vasopressin. So the bottom line is casual sex is not casual. Unless you're so drunk you can't remember who you slept with, it's not casual. Something happens in the brain. You're either turned on or you're turned off, and there's chemical experience in the brain. In fact, I'm doing a study, this is the 3rd year in a row that I've done this study with Match.com. And it's a national study, it's the biggest that's ever been done. We use poll over 5,000 people every year. And not the same people every year, but every year we do a 3rd year in a row. And we don't poll the Match.com population, it's based on the US Census. So we got the right number of blacks, whites, Asians, Latinos, gay, straight, rural, suburban, urban, etc. And one of the questions I've asked every single year is, Have you ever had a one-night, gone into what you regarded as going to be a one-night stand that turned into a long-term partnership? And every year between 35 and 40% of people say yes. So these brain systems are connected, but they're not always connected. You can lie in bed and feel deep attachment to one person, and then swing into feelings of wild romantic love for somebody else, and then swing into feelings of a sex drive for a range of people. It's as if there's a committee meeting going on in your head as you're feeling one brain system or another. Of course, leaving the human animal with this big cerebral cortex with not only the great joys of feeling all three systems for one person and the great sorrows of feeling a different one for different people. So, the one that I study is romantic love. Before I started in putting people in a brain scanner, I needed to know what some of the brain circuits, some of the traits in order to create my hypothesis. The first thing that happens when you fall in love with somebody is that person takes on what we call special meaning. As one man said to me, he said the world had a new center, and that center was Mary Ann. Emily Dickinson called it the realm of you. I love world poetry because I think other anthropologists would use potsherds or arrowheads or all kinds of sophisticated artifacts of human nature. And I think poetry and all of the arts are a wonderful way to understand human feelings. So the first thing that happens is that a person takes on special meaning, and then you focus on them. You know, you can list what you don't like about them, but you sweep that aside and just focus. Just focus on what you do. Everything about them is special. Their car is different from every other car in the parking lot. The street they live on is different. The books that they read, every single thing about them becomes special. You feel intense energy. You can walk all night and talk till dawn. A guy from a little island in the South Seas, he said, I felt like jumping in the sky. And indeed, you get that energy actually from dopamine. Euphoria when things are going well, mood swings into terrible despair when they're going poorly. Real bodily reactions, butterflies in the stomach. Stendhal once said, he said, every time I would take her arm, I felt as if I had forgotten how to walk. Emotional dependence, as one man, he said, anything she liked, I liked. Real emotional dependence. Frustration, separation anxiety, you know, I would ask me, before I put them in the machine, I would ask them a whole lot of questions, and one of them is, well, how do you feel when you're not together? I mean, is it really, you know, nice when they go out of town for about 4 days or something? And they look at me as if I'm daft, I mean, just out of my mind that they would want to be without this individual. They're very possessive. The ethological term is mate guarding. All kinds of animals do mate guarding. It is that one characteristic of romantic love that probably creates the crimes of passion around the world. As a matter of fact, you know, I was at a neuroscience convention, and a neuroscientist said to me, he said, you know, Helen, probably more people die of with issues of romantic love than die of cancer. We don't know the answer to that, but bottom line is, everywhere in the world, people are killing themselves, killing other people, slipping into clinical depression, stalking each other because of this powerful brain system. But the three main characteristics of romantic love are intense craving for this individual. Yeah, you want to go to bed with them, but what you really want them to do is to call, write, invite you out, and tell you that they love you. You want emotional union with him or her. You're highly motivated to win them. What people will do for romantic love is out of this world. I met one guy a few years ago who had flown to Australia for lunch. It took 1 month to recover. And probably the most important trait of all for romantic love is this obsessive thinking. The most important question that I would ask somebody before I put them in the brain scanner is, what percentage of the day and night do you think about him or her? And they would say, I never stop thinking about her. I wake up thinking about her. I go to bed thinking about her. I never stop thinking about her. Last but not least, it's involuntary. As Stendhal once said, he said, love is like a fever. It comes and goes quite independently of the will. And indeed it does. So with these particular traits in hand, I began to look at them, and I said everything there that is in red are traits that are linked with the dopamine system in the brain. Traits in light blue, that's linked with the norepinephrine system, the vasopressin system, and low levels of serotonin. So I began to think, if I look in the brain, maybe I would find elevated activity in the dopamine system because of these traits, and low activity in the serotonin system. Hopefully I was going to find something with those two other systems as well. So I designed the experiment. I'll tell you in the question and answer period. It takes a little while to tell you what the, basically what it is you've got to scan the same brain at the same time. So here is my hypothesis that I would find elevated activity in dopamine and norepinephrine and low activity in serotonin. So this is my group of people, Lucy Brown, our neuroscientist, she reads the scans, Art Aaron, and some graduate students. And we began to put them in a machine. This is from the New Yorker. You can't get two people in an MRI machine. But this is what happens when you're in the machine. I asked you to bring, first of all, I interview them at great length. These are very expensive, it's very time consuming. I put myself in 3 times before I put anybody in to have the experience and explain it to others. And what they would do is bring in 2 photographs. One of their sweetheart that really gives them that rush of romantic love, not the sex drive, but romantic love, and a neutral photograph of somebody who, when they look at that photograph, it calls forth no positive or negative reactions. So we're going to scan the same brain in that state of heightened energy and when it's in a neutral state. The problem with that is that when you're madly in love with somebody, you can't stop thinking about them. So we needed a distraction task. And between the positive and the neutral, we cast a large number on the screen, like 8,421. And you've got to look at that number and just in your mind, count backwards in increments of 7. Nobody does it. We did have some engineers, they weren't any better than anybody else. That's what we wanted. And so that way we were able to capture what's going on. Then we put all the scans of the person, the madly in love scans with those of the neutral scans, cancel out what they have in common, and you have the brain in love. So we found activity in a lot of places, but basically in a tiny little factory near the base of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, in some cells called the A10 cells that actually make dopamine and spray dopamine to many brain regions. This is part of the brain's reward system, the brain system for wanting, for craving, for obsession, for motivation, for focus, and for energy. And when I saw these scans, it finally occurred to me that romantic love was not an emotion. I had been thinking all along, it's an emotion, or it's a series of emotions from high to low. And indeed it is. But it's basically a drive. It comes from primitive brain regions, way below the limbic system for the emotions, way below the cortex for thinking, linked with drive. In this case, the drive, I think, to find life's greatest prize, which is a mating partner. As a matter of fact, as I say, I read a lot of poetry, and I think everybody who's, they all write about love, and all over the world. And I think the best, most accurate is that by Plato, who said, the God of love lives in a state of need. It is a need, it is a craving, it is a want, it is a homeostatic imbalance. In this case, and I'll say it again, the drive to win life's greatest prize, which is a mating partner. So I looked and it has a lot of the characteristics of a drive. What's most interesting to me is that doesn't have any facial expression. You know, you can look at somebody and know whether they're mad, or whether they're sad, or whether they're happy. You can't look at somebody and know whether they're hungry or thirsty. And in the same way, you can't look at somebody and know whether they're in love. Many characteristics of that are linked in with the drive. It's stronger than the sex drive. Americans love to talk about how strong the sex drive is, but you know, if you ask somebody casually to go to bed with you and they say no thank you, you don't kill yourself. Around the world, people are killing themselves or someone else or slipping into real problems because of romantic, much stronger brain system than the sex drive. So I then began to think, love at first sight. It's actually very easy to explain. This brain system we share with other animals. In fact, I will maintain that romantic love evolved from this wanting system in all birds and mammals. And it's very easy to explain. On my Match.com studies, almost 60% of men have experienced love at first sight, and about 45 or 50% of women have experienced love at first sight. And I think what's going on in the brain, it's like, let's go to squirrels. You know, a squirrel, in the beginning of a breeding season, she's got to find another squirrel. She can't spend 3 years discussing his college plans. She's got to get on with this project. So she sees a nice squirrel with nice ears and fluffy tail and nice gait, and boom, it is going to trigger this brain circuitry for attraction, and she can get on with the mating process. And I think that that's what happens in love at first sight. That it's a brain system like the fear system that can get triggered instantly. So I began to think to myself, now, you know, who cares about happily in love people? It's when you've been rejected in love that you turn into a pest. You know, not only for the people around you, but certainly for yourself. And so I studied addiction. It's really very much more important to me. The most important academic article I feel I've ever written or will ever write was my study of people who've been rejected in love. There's many ways and there's many traits of addiction that you can see clearly in people who are rejected in love. So I began to put people into the brain scanner who had just been broken up with. It's very difficult. I'm not a psychologist. I am an anthropologist. They are in horrible shape. And in fact, we began looking at the brain. I began by putting out a flyer around the Rutgers campus, SUNY Stony Brook, and Albert Einstein in New York City. And have you just been rejected but can't let go? And it's happening. Nobody gets out of love alive almost immediately. When they ask the question, have you ever been rejected? This is a college population. 93% said yes. And when they asked, have you ever rejected somebody who really loved you, 95% said yes. Yes. So, and they're still in college. I mean, they've got another 40 years to get done. So, bottom line is, we didn't have any trouble finding people who wanted to help science, and I began putting them into the brain scanner. And indeed, we found exactly what I was looking for. Activity in what's called the nucleus accumbens. It's part of this reward system with the ventral tegmental area. It is central to the major addictions. Certainly the cocaine addiction and cigarette addiction and all addictions in one way or another loop into this system. So we have found that romantic love is an addiction. A perfectly wonderful addiction when it's going well, and a perfectly horrible addiction when it's going poorly. An activity in the VTA, you know, when you've just been dumped, you just love them harder. What a bad deal. 3 brain regions linked with craving, a brain region linked with physical pain. In fact, an article came out about a month ago, and they have discovered that taking aspirin for when you've been rejected actually helps the feeling of rejection. Isn't that interesting? Because it's physical pain as well as psychological pain, and it can be alleviated to some extent, even with aspirin. And last but not least, feelings of deep attachment. All of these brain regions became activated among those people who were rejected in love. That's a very bad group of experience. You're deeply attached, you're madly in love, you're in physical and emotional pain, and you crave somebody. No wonder around the world we do see these crimes of passion. So I think romantic love evolved. There's not an animal on this planet that would copulate with anybody. And maybe when they're stuck in a shoebox in a science lab and they drop one mouse in on top of another, they could say that they're not going to be too picky. But in the wild, you know, too old, too young, too scruffy, too scrubbed, too weird and acting, they don't do it. We all have favorites. And in fact, that favoritism we now are comes from that same brain system, the dopamine system, the reward system, the brain system for wanting. So I'm going to very rapidly trace the evolution of romantic love. Charles Darwin once said, it was evidently a case of love at first sight, for she swam around the newcomer, caressing me with overtures of affection. He believed that other animals did fall in love. I do too. There's not 2 of us. Trying to get the rest of my colleagues to understand it. Unfortunately, it was a mallard duck that fell in love with a pintail duck. You gotta, that's a big mistake. You gotta pick somebody from your own species. But bottom line, all kinds of animals do show a real signs of affection and romance, but not that long. Now, for example, a fox will show it for maybe about 20 days. An elephant will show this attraction for about 5 days. A rat will show it for about 30 seconds. And of course, human beings show it for a long period of time. But they do show that deep attraction to specific individuals. And you can see it in all kinds of species. They're doing the deep French kiss. We know that because they come up to anthropologists and kiss them like that. And here's the distinction between humanity and almost all of our relatives, the mammals. Our closest relatives are chimpanzees. The female does not form a pair bond. She does have attractions. There's certain individuals that she is attracted to, but they don't need to form a long-term relationship. And they don't need to because the female lives in the trees. She has the protection of the trees. She carries her baby on her back. She does not need someone to help her rear her young. When you take a look at the ecological reasons for pair bonding or monogamy, mono means one, gen means spouse, or pair bonding, there's got to be some really important ecological reasons. And indeed, these individuals do not. The trees began to disappear 5-6 million years ago. Our ancestors were forced down to the ground. They began to stand up on 2 feet instead of 4, the most important thing our ancestors ever did. And here's my theory. I just don't see how a female could carry now in her arm the equivalent of a 20-pound bowling ball for 4 years without some help. So I think that the evolution of pair bonding, at least long enough to raise a child through infancy, was essential for females and suitable for males. I don't see how that guy's going to protect and provide for our harem. And we evolved in the human brain not only a deep and longer-term sense of romantic love, but also a deep sense of attachment to a partner. 97% of mammals do not pair up to rear their young. Human beings do. Yes, we are adulterers, but that's not the news. The news is that we bother to pair up at all, and indeed we do. And in fact, when a relationship goes awry, we try it all over again. You know, Samuel Johnson once called remarriage the triumph of hope over experience, and indeed, that's just what we do. So we have evidence from the fossil record that perhaps by 4.4 million years ago, pair bonding was beginning to evolve. Something that we see, of course, around the world today. So, why him? Why her? Why do you fall in love with one person rather than another? That's what Match.com asked me, and I said, I don't know. I do know, and scientists do know, that timing is important. You tend to fall in love with somebody from the same socioeconomic and ethnic background, someone with the same level of intelligence, good looks, education, someone with the same religious and social values, and someone with the same goals. Your childhood always plays a role, but you can walk into a room and everybody is from your background and level of intelligence and level of good, and you don't fall in love with all of them. So I said to them, I said, I don't know. I began to think about it, and I thought to myself, well, psychologists tend to divide personality into 2 broad hats. All your experiences from your childhood and your nature, your temperament. And I began to think to myself, maybe I should look at the biology of the brain, figure out human temperament, and see if basic biology naturally draws you to some people rather than others. Now, I don't want to skip over the fact that this is the most important thing that's happened in my lifetime. The fact that we now know that cultural experiences can turn genes on and off. So there's a constant relationship between culture and nature. That given, I wanted to take a look at human temperament and see if that part of who we are draws you naturally to some people rather than others. So I'm going to start out with something, it's just a metaphor for what I'm going to say next. And basically, it's about intimacy. Men and women tend to get intimacy differently. Women tend to get intimacy from face-to-face talking. We swivel until we're face-to-face. We focus on each other. It's called the anchoring gaze, and we talk. It's intimacy to women. It comes, I think, from millions of years of holding that baby in front of your face, cajoling it, reprimanding it, and educating it with words. Words were women's tools, and that words are women's intimacy today. Men tend to get intimacy from doing things side by side. When he looks up, he'll look away. You know, on a Sunday afternoon, they can have a very intimate afternoon watching the television together. Nobody says anything at all, and it was a jolly little time. The problem, of course, is this. So, given that we are different, what are the basic styles of thinking and behaving, and what do they mean for love? So, I started in, once again, looking at all kinds of academic studies, genetic studies. For example, if you give a Parkinson's patient L-Dopa, you're driving up the dopamine system in the brain, and they can become extremely creative. And on. There's all kinds of... So I began to build, by looking at all these chemical systems in the brain, a list of traits that were linked with certain chemical systems. And I came to see that there are 4 basic biological systems that is each one of them linked with a constellation of personality traits. Now, there's a lot of other systems in the brain. Most of them just keep the eyes blinking and the heart beating. They're not linked with personality traits. If I had found 5, it would be 5. If I found 15, it would have been 15. I found 4. So I'm going to go through. So what I decided I would do is make a questionnaire to asking the questions linked with each one of these 4 broad styles, constellations of personality traits, put it on this new dating site, have people take this questionnaire, and then watch who's naturally drawn to whom. So, this is some of the, I find unpredictable situations exhilarating. I figured my dopamine people would like that more than others, and so on. As I said, I just studied 100,000 people. There's 4 answers to each one of these questions. No 2 people, about 100,000 people, answered my questionnaire the same way, which was very pleasing to me, because I've never met 2 people who are like, I'm an identical twin, and even we are not exactly alike. No 2 people are alike. But these 4 broad styles of thinking and behaving mathematically came out. They come out over and over when I study them. So I'm going to go rapidly through them and then explain who's naturally drawn to whom. We're all a combination of all of them, of course, as I mentioned. There's no 2 people who are alike. So people who are more expressive of the dopamine norepinephrine system, I call them explorers. I had to come up with some term because I was working with a dating site. Not crazy about the terms, but I'm stuck with them now. So they tend to be novelty-seeking, risk-taking. The academic term is sensation-seeking. They're curious. They have the most interest. They're most likely to go to college. They make the most money. They lose the most money. They're entrepreneurs, restless, energetic. Not just physical exploration, but mental exploration. Some of them never leave the house, but they will read 10 hours a day. Enthusiasm and optimism both linked once again with the dopamine norepinephrine system. Independent, self-reliant, impulsive, spontaneously generous, mentally flexible, and idea generation as the main central aspect of this neural constellation of traits. On the downside, they can be susceptible to boredom. That's me. I probably brought a month of work on the plane down here today from, just in case I'm on the tarmac in Atlanta for 1 month, I'll have something to do. They tend to be reckless, unreflective, they look out, not in, manic, can be quite insincere, opportunistic, and unpredictable. So there's a dark side to every woman. I did a study of 178,000 people to see what words these people used. There's something called the lexical hypothesis. It comes out of the 1930s, and it's the hypothesis that you use the words of who you are. And so I want to know if you use the words of who you were biologically. And the top word that these people use, adventure, energy, new, fun, traveling, outgoing, passion, active. So it's not just how what your interests are, but actually the words you choose as you express yourself. Richard Branson is a perfect example. I've always thought rules were made to be broken. No question about that. Lang Lang, the concert pianist, flair, dazzling, charisma, bravado, daredevil, extremes, bullying, by storm. Very different cognitive promises, very different talents, but the same basic temperament. They live in the big cities. I didn't study anything in Georgia. They're not down in Dallas or Houston. They're in the big cities where the action is. The second is the high serotonin type. I call them builders. They tend to observe social norms. We've even found out where that is in the brain. They want the familiar. They want to go to the same bar on Friday night, see the same friends on Friday night. They go to the same, place, for the summer, whatever. They're not scared. They're cautious, but they're not scared. They just want to avoid harm. Calm, self-controlled. Plans, routines, and schedules. Orderly. They're very orderly. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who told me the following story about him and his wife. Every year they go to the accountant. Well, about 10 years ago, they were at the accountant's, and he leaned on the accountant's desk, and by mistake, he just moved the guy's pencil sharpener. And the guy nearly moved it back. And now every single year, he moves the pencil, and every year they need order. They need schedules. They're quite literal, detail-oriented. Yeah, I made a huge mistake, I'll tell you. My book on this, Why Him, Why Her, had come out, and I happened to be in Seattle. And I was being interviewed by the head of the major newspaper about the book, and I could tell she couldn't stand me. And the more I knew that, the more flamboyant I got, because that's what I am more naturally, and the more she couldn't stand me. And of course, the following morning, that was all revealed to me when she wrote the paper. But I learned at that moment, the golden rule is do this to others as you would have them do unto you. No. It's the platinum rule. Do it to others as they would have done unto them. Yeah. Figure out who they are and give them. I should have pulled back and talked all about the Cronbach's alpha and eigen analysis and the nucleus accumbens and just shower her with those details. And I think I would have succeeded. They tend to they want to belong. They follow the rules. Religiosity is in the serotonin system and some of the genes. Loyalty is an interesting one, mathematically. One of my questions, I can't remember exactly what the question is, but it's something like, would you rather have loyal friends or interesting friends? This type cannot tolerate unloyal friends. And the other three types cannot tolerate uninteresting friends. We all want both of them, of course, but they cannot tolerate uninteresting friends. It's a real mathematical divide between the high serotonin type and other types. On the downside, they can tend to be closed-minded, controlling, because they've got to have it all under control, particularly their control, more rigid, stubborn, and moralistic. The top word they use is family, morals, respect, loyal, trust, trustworthiness, values. Top 10 words, these are the words they use in their profiles on the dating site, chemistry.com. Hu Jintao, the former president, he's a cookie cutter builder type. As a matter of fact, there's a gene in the serotonin system for social norm conformity, and it is most prevalent in China and Japan. He's another cookie cutter. I read a lot of books about him and books by him. And he's a very good example, once again, of the high serotonin type. The third type is the director, those expressive primarily of testosterone. They've got good analytical, spatial skills, math, engineering, computers. Music is very spatial. They're inventive, skeptical, daring, rank-oriented. If you inject testosterone into a monkey or a lizard or a dove, it'll be in a fight for rank. as a matter of fact, there's something called dominance matching. And what these people will do is they will attack. And they expect you to attack back. And I learned this one night in New York. I was at a black tie dinner, and I was talking with 4 men, and one of them was from the Wall Street Journal, and he was taking me to the cleaners. And there's 2 basic postural messages in the animal community, looking little and looking big. It's called crouch and loom. And the more he attacked, the smaller I got. And then finally, something happened in my brain, and I turned around and I said something that was vicious. And it was, I don't remember what it was, but it was vicious. And it was also funny. And all of a sudden we all went, it's called the bar tooth display. Chimpanzees do it, parties trying to figure out what you're doing. And all of a sudden I thought, if he thinks like a woman, he'll never forget me. If he acts like a man, and he's doing his dominance matching, he will like me. And there's this long silence, all of a sudden he threw his hands up, he said, Helen, and started to laugh. That let the other 3 laugh, and in fact, he's liked me ever since. And one of the things I do in the business community is when somebody attack back, they will respect. It's very difficult for a lot of women to do. Emotionally contained, I have a girlfriend who said to me, she told me the story about her husband, and her husband, she said to her husband, she said, you know, sweetie, you haven't told me that you love me in a month. And he said, well, I said that last month, and nothing's changed. Emotionally contained. Decisive, bold, direct, these are the ones that really get to the point. On the downside, uncompromising, impatient, demanding, mind blindness, the inability to see into somebody else's thoughts, and less empathetic. I like this one. You know, people look as if that's a bad deal. But you know, for millions of years on the grasslands of Africa, a man's job was to slit the throat of that baby gazelle. He can't be weeping as he goes and tries to bring home dinner. I mean, there are places for a lack of empathy, and indeed, it's linked with the system and aloof. Real. They gotta have it real. They're the least religious of the driven nerd debate. Etc. Steve Jobs is the Svengali of the digital revolution, brass, demanding, brutally honest. And he's also very, shows the high testosterone. These high brow ridges, the zygomatic cheekbone, this very strong jaw is all built by testosterone. Hilary Clinton is a good example, I think, of a female. When asked why she was attracted to Bill, she said he wasn't afraid of me. A very high testosterone woman. The 4th of them is those expressive of estrogen and oxytocin. By the way, a lot of football players are very high on estrogen as well as testosterone. High on both, low on one, low on the other, low on both. They tend to see the big picture. They take a holistic, contextual, long-term view. Imaginative, that's one of the things that many more women in this category than men in every culture that I looked in. And I think they bring this to school and to work, their imagination, mental flexibility. Linguistic skills, it's called executive social skills, and women are better than men. For millions of years, they had to look at that baby and figure out what's going on, and the baby wouldn't tell them. So you got to read posture, gesture, tone of voice, etc. Intuitive, we now understand actually the biology, the brain architecture of being intuitive. I don't have time to tell you, but we can say it a different time. Trusting. Anthropologists have never really been able to understand the evolution of being trusting. They've often thought, well, you know, you trust the wrong person, you're really up the creek. But if you trust the right person, you save a lot of metabolic energy. And indeed, these people are built to know who to trust. And you can begin to see how different traits evolve together as a constellation. Introspective, everything means something, you know, Freud once said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. None of them. Everything means something. Seek harmony, they're agreeable, emotionally expressive, and what we call diplomatic intelligence. On the downside, they can be scattered, indecisive. You know, somebody will say, well, where do you want to go for dinner? Oh, we can go here, I want to go there. I say, well, they go to Miami, I don't want to go here, we can go there. Because they can see that with this web thinking, they get collecting data from so many places and putting in all kinds of patterns that makes them appear very indecisive. Placating, they want to please. ruminating and faint, death, any kind of situation. You know, there's a big fight in the office or in the school or something, and afterwards the men go out for a beer. No, the women think about it for 3 weeks. They can be quite gullible, hypersensitive, backstabbing, not going to hit you in the face, and stab you in the back. Unforgiving. There's more estrogen receptors in the hippocampus, and women remember. They remember what you did not do last summer. They remember what you didn't do 15 years ago. I think it's a bit of a blight that we do remember quite as much as we do. They can be effusive. Top word they use is passion, passionate, heart, real, reader. These are the big readers of the world. They are so verbally skilled. Random. They like the word random. No techie likes the word random. Oprah Winfrey, I think, is a very good example. And I think Clinton's a good example. He's the one that cried at his daughter's wedding, not his wife. The whole world knows he can't stop talking. There's very fine people skills, emotionally expressive. He wrote a book that's over 900 pages, and he says it's important to have a synthesizing mind. That's the high estrogen type. As a matter of fact, people will say, well, they wonder who our first female president is going to be. I think we've already had You need to see it in his face. It's a very soft face. And of course, Charles Darwin. We're all a combination of all of these. There isn't a human being on this planet who has made so many connections to all living things as this one man. So here's where they all live. All the high serotonin types are in Georgia. More religious, more Republican, more traditional. High testosterone is all around Washington, D.C., where they're trying to run the world. Or they're out in Nevada gambling, that's nice and spatial. Or they're in Alaska shooting animals, that's nice and spatial. Everything that is loose rolls into California. I don't that type. And of course, the Northeast and the Northwest, more liberal, more middle flexible, more democratic, and the big readers of the world, men and women. So, Match.com doesn't care about that. Match.com wants to know why you fall in love with one person rather than another. So I have this whole system, and I started looking, I've done it many times now, at 28,000 people. I know what they answered on this questionnaire. How did they then, who were they naturally drawn to? And as it turns out, high dopamine, the explorer type, wants somebody like themselves. They want somebody who's going to get up off the couch at 7:30 and race over to the Metropolitan Opera or go nude swimming in Central Park. They want somebody who's going to go and do exciting things with them. Somebody who's equally curious, creative, spontaneous, and energetic. Traditional wants traditional. The builder, the high serotonin type, wants somebody like themselves. In those two cases, similarity attracts. Opposites attract when it comes to the high testosterone and the high estrogen. I've got all kinds of anthropological hypotheses for why these particular patterns evolved. I won't go into them now, but the bottom line is, a lot of scientists have said, oh, well, similarity always attracts, or opposites attract. And the bottom line is it depends on who you are. If I were with a group of people who were therapists, I would then go into the problems and the joys of every one of these combinations and other combinations too. But I wanted to know with my colleagues, can it last? And a young PhD student who's now got her PhD, Bianca Acevedo, is first author. We began to put people into the brain scanner who reported they were still in love, not loving, but in love, after an average of 21 years of marriage, people in their 50s and 60s. And sure enough, we found, there's Bianca, Lucy, our brain scientists, and the activity in the same ventral tegmental area that makes the dopamine, as we found among people who had just fallen happily in love. We also found activity in a brain region linked with attachment, and there's a difference, one difference between those who had just fallen in love and those who were in love long term. And that was among people who had just fallen happily in love, There's a lot of activity in the brain region linked with anxiety. You know, when you just fall in love, you are anxious. You know, am I too fat? What did I say that for? How come I didn't do that? He must be meant that. You know, you're anxious. Whereas in long-term love, those regions are no longer active, and instead we find activity in brain regions linked with calm. So, our last thing, I'll tell you a couple of things. We stumbled on what makes a happy relationship. I cannot tell you how many articles there are and how many academics have looked to understand the roots of human happiness in a partnership. They've never found anything that they can agree on, except one thing. And we didn't mean to be looking for it. We were in China, and colleagues of mine decided to redo my basic experiment among the Chinese. Got to do that in basic science, you've got to keep doing it in different parts of the world. And we found activity, sure enough, in the ventral tegmental area and other brain regions linked with romantic love. And then they all went away, and 40 months later, 3.5 years later, they decided they would go back to those people who they had put in the machine 40 months before then, and see who was still together and who was not together. And they found a good 50% had broken up, and a good 50% had not broken up. And they looked to see if there was any differences in the brains of those who had not broken up. And they found activity in a tiny little place in the medial orbitofrontal cortex, and that brain region is linked with what we call positive illusions, the ability to overlook anything you can't stand about this person and focus on what you do. And the people who were still in love showed, actually it was a deactivation in that brain region. Activation in that brain region is linked with being realistic and being more negative. A deactivation is linked with a tendency to overlook, over-evaluate your partner, and suspend negative judgment. Positive illusions. So, 30 years later, you see the high school picture, and you see the couple as they're looking 30 years later, and if he still thinks she's that young, beautiful, thin, smart, funny, kind, charming creature, they will remain in love. So, I'm going to close with just a couple things that I've been doing since. This is by far the most important slide for me. What we've done is we've now put 45 people in two fMRI studies. We've had them take my questionnaire on personality first, and then study their brains. And indeed, we found that most people who scored high on the Explorer scale showed more activity in the dopamine system, exactly what you would expect. Those who were higher on the serotonin scale showed activity in a brain region linked with social norm compliance. Those who scored high on the testosterone scale showed more activity in a brain region linked with analytical and executive functioning. And those who scored highest on the estrogen scale showed more activity in the mirror neurons linked with empathy. So we're beginning to map the brain circuitry linked with personality measure. So I've now started a new company called, I only got that title last week, Neurocolor. We're going to start going into corporate places and get people to understand how to use some of this new science in order to understand your boss and your colleagues and build a corporate board. And that's very interesting. After I sent a rough draft of my book on this to my editor, and I knew he was going to call and give me some sort of response. And he did call, and there was this long pause, and then he said, "I finally understand my son." So I do think that, the more, we know a great deal about one's cultural background, but it's time that we begin to know some of their temperament as well. So I'm going to close with this. For millions of years, we lived in little hunting and gathering bands. Anthropologists think that we, probably about 25 individuals lived in a band. 10 to 12 of those individuals were juveniles and infants. That leaves about 10 or 12 grown-ups. And they're all walking together over the fields, and they suddenly come across a pile of mushrooms. You can't have all of the high dopamine explorers say, let's try the mushrooms. You're going to have some of the traditional builder serotonin types who say, we've never tried these mushrooms. They're not in our tradition. You're going to need some experimental high testosterone engineers who say, well, let's feed the mushrooms to the dog and see what happens. Experiment here. And you need some high estrogen negotiator types to say, let's sit down and pool our data on these mushrooms. The bottom line is we were built to put our heads together, not only in love,